Rejected, throwing away, affected. I don't know what to say. Ejected, cast out to the sea, disconnected. They didn't want me.
Welcome to a brand new episode of Nicksmissal III. I am Patricia and I'm here with Alvin and James.
Here.
So today we're going to be discussing about another franchise that Nickelodeon wanted to take advantage of, but unfortunately it was canceled. We're talking about the Smurfs movie. Now, believe it or not, they wanted to make an entire trilogy of the Smurfs. They wanted to do a trilogy of the Smurfs movie in honor of its 50th anniversary. This movie would have come out in 2008. So the story behind it was that Jordan Kerner had obtained the licensing rights of the Smurfs to do to basically do this entire trilogy based off of, the Smurfs, like, the origins of the Smurfs, to be more specific. Like, it would explain about where the Smurfs came from, it would explain more about Gargamel, everything about just the origins of the Smurfs. And, the first movie would have been discussing about the Smurfs, the second one would have been, going into Gargamel's backstory, and then the third one was basically, how everything just got settled into the Smurfs TV show that we would know of today. However, things did not go so well because around 2008, Columbia Pictures and Sony Pictures Animation obtained the film rights to do their own version of the Smurfs movie, which is the movie that we would know about that came out in 2010.
Oh my gosh, I just gotta wash the stink out my eyes.
Oh yeah, that movie is completely atrocious. Both of them, to be quite honest. Similar to that movie, the Smurfs movie that Paramount and Nickelodeon movies wanted to do was that they wanted to do a CGI movie, but they wanted to stick closer to, not only the original cartoons, but they also wanted to go inspired to do it based off of the comic series. There's some early animation footage that was leaked in early 2008, as well as a handful of pictures, but any information besides that is pretty much unknown. All we know is that there's little bits and pieces of, what the plot would have been, but that's pretty much it. We don't know anything about cast choices, or we don't know anything about what the full story would have been, so yeah. This is as much information as we were able to get, and of how, Sony and Columbia Pictures were able to get the rights to it, and the reason why they wanted to do it in the first place was because about a year prior, they made a whole bunch of money doing a movie based off of another 80s cartoon classic, the Alvin and Chipmunks movie.
Oh, I am actually surprised that this is still going. I mean, you would have thought that they would have faded out by now, and that's not even through a biased hate standpoint. I hate them, don't get me wrong, but even technically, you'd think that they would have started making them, just like Transformers movies. They were only made to cash in on 80s nostalgia.
Yeah, and the most ironic thing about this is that we have that Alvin show on Nickelodeon. So let me get this straight. Paramount and Nickelodeon movies wanted to do a trilogy series based off of the Smurfs, but they were unable to do it because Sony and Columbia Pictures purchased the rights from, the original rights holder to do it after doing successfully on the Alvin and Chipmunks movies. And now there's an Alvin and Chipmunks TV show on Nickelodeon. The irony just baffles me.
Me too. That's probably why they built the hell out of it.
Yeah, definitely. I just want to know, what would have happened if Nickelodeon and, if Paramount would have done their version of the Smurfs movies that they wanted to do instead of Sony?
Either way, I think it would have probably turned out terrible.
Oh, really? I'm going to say the complete opposite of this. I think I don't know how well this one would have done, but I think it would have been slightly better than the Sony version, because they wanted to stick closer to the original cartoons and they wanted to stick closer to the original cartoon and the comics, and they wanted to build up more backstory. They were thinking about maybe turning this into a much more darker direction, especially when they went over to Gargamel's backstory. So I think it would have done a little bit better than the Sony version.
I think my opinion has changed.
Oh, okay. So yeah, it's a shame that, this happened, especially the writers of the Sony movie turned out to be, David N. Weiss and J. David Stern, which, as previously mentioned in other podcasts, they were the ones who also wrote on various movies and TV shows. Like, they were writers on Rugrats. More specifically, they were the ones who wrote the Hanukkah special and the Mother's Day special, and they were the ones who wrote the first two Rugrats movies. And they also wrote a whole bunch of other Disney, those straight to VHS sequels. And also, not to mention, they were also the ones who helped write, Shrek 2. So I'm just surprised that, they were able to write something like that. But then again, Will McRobb and Chris Viscardi wrote the Alvin and Chipmunks movies, so I can't really say too much otherwise. But
I was actually surprised, considering that usually what Will McRobb and Chris Viscardi make are usually very good.
Well, I mean, I think when it comes to their, I think when it comes to, like, Pete and Pete and Kablam, yes, they're very good. But I think when it comes to movies, they're either a bit mediocre or just downright awful. Like, a few podcasts ago, we were talking about Snow Day when the Pete and Pete movie got canceled. And then there was a few other movies that they'd done, such as The Tale of Despero, which I thought it was okay, just a bit forgettable. Then there's the Alvin and Chipmunks movie. Then there was Angus Thongs and Perfect Snogging, which was based off of a British book, which I saw the movie, and it's pretty okay. Nothing really much to say about it. But yeah, I mean, one of the worst things that they have ever done, hands down, was the Alvin and Chipmunks movie, because that movie's just atrocious. Anyway, but getting back on topic, I think that, in my personal opinion, if they really wanted to focus on doing this entire trilogy, going into the backstory of the Smurfs and on Gargamel, I think that this would have maybe possibly been like the foundation for much better movies based off of 80s cartoons or even comic books, because before the Smurfs movie would have came out, we already had a few other movies, family-friendly movies, based off of comic strips, such as there was the 2 live-action Garfield movies, and then there was the Marmaduke movie.
Oh, yeah, I remember that, with Owen Wilson.
Yeah, that's the one with Owen Wilson.
Oh my gosh, I hated that.
Yeah, that movie was awful. Just thinking about those movies was just, I think if the Smurfs really wanted to go into the direction that that they were planning on, I think it would have led up to maybe even more better, movies based off of either cartoons or maybe, comic strips. I mean, even though that we already discussed in, the previous podcast about the Bone movie that would have came out, and that Nickelodeon wanted to tone it down to be more family friendly, it seemed like, they really wanted to be very faithful, because the person who was going to write this movie and produce it was Jordan Kerner. Jordan Kerner was the one who produced the 2006 adaptation of Charlotte's Web. And Charlotte's Web, even though many people didn't really like the live-action version, it was very faithful to the books. And since he was coming back to do the Smurfs movie, I think he would have definitely focused more on the actual adaptations of the Smurfs, as opposed to in the 2010 Smurfs movie done by Sony, in which they had the Smurfs in the Smurf village for like a few minutes, and then they just go to New York to help out Neil Patrick Harris dealing with, him being afraid of, having a child and stuff like that. And then the second movie, in which they go to Paris, and then they meet up with the, the Naughties or something, and it's about, Neil Patrick Harris concerned about, his father coming into his life or something. I don't know. But the point is that, had this movie would have come out, I think it would have definitely been more faithful to what the cartoons and the comics were, and less about whatever Sony was doing. And I think that would have definitely changed in the line of cinema, because I think we would have gotten much better products. Like, I mean, in recent years, movies based off of animated properties hasn't really fared well. Let's see, there was the Yogi Bear movie that came out. There was the Gem and the Holograms movie, which I still want to drown my eyes in bleach and just forget everything about it, even though that I have yet to see this movie. I did see clips of it, and I've seen people review that movie, and I was like, oh my god, whoever was in charge of doing that Gem and the Holograms movie, they just did it as a joke. They just basically try to update it, and not retain any of the charm that the Gem and the Holograms had. I mean, and to be fair, there was little charm in the 80s version, but there were some things you could laugh at. And, it's funny because, going into that Gem and the Holograms movie, you know about Andre Meadows, right, from Black Nerd Comedy?
Yeah, I do.
He actually discussed about another movie that was kind of similar to Gem and the Holograms that came out like a decade prior, that he felt was better because it kind of like satirized the music industry. It was the live-action adaptation of Josie and the Pussycats. Have you ever seen that movie?
I think so.
I mean, ever since Gem and the Holograms came out on theaters, a lot of people were kind of saying, you know what, looking back on it, Josie and the Pussycats maybe wasn't a bad movie after all, because it was satirizing, fashion and the music industry and pop songs and whatever. And, the way that Andre was talking about it, it's like, you know what, it kind of makes me interested of me watching that movie. And, you know what, adaptations is a very funny thing, because, at the time of this recording, the Ratchet and Clank movie came out, and it was supposed to be, like, really faithful to the video games. And that's what everybody wanted. They wanted it to be faithful to the video games, because we've had movies based off of video games that came out in the past that were absolutely nothing like it.
I personally felt, from the sounds of it, some friends have actually told me that it was. I just think that these days, critics can a lot more caustic than they used to be.
Yeah, what I'm trying to get at is that, sometimes it can go one way or the other. It's like, you have instances in which, like the Ratchet and Clank movie, it caters a lot to the fans and not to the general public. But then you have something like the Angry Birds movie, in which, these reviews are very early, so I can't really say for sure, but apparently the Angry Birds movie is doing a lot better in ratings because it actually caters to, the people who just played Angry Birds, and also to a general audience who probably never even played Angry Birds, because there's nothing to Angry Birds. Angry Birds is just about birds fighting off pigs because they're stealing their eggs. There's nothing to it. And Ratchet and Clank has this deep lore and a whole bunch of games that has a flowing narrative. So what I'm getting to the Smurfs is that even though the Smurfs on the surface is very, very simplistic, it's about a bunch of blue creatures that live in a small village and it has magic, and there's this wizard that's trying to eat them, or trying to capture them so that he can gain more magic or something, depending on the version that you're talking about. And, on the surface, you could tell a very simple story. But on the other hand, the Smurfs has a gigantic lore that could have really benefited from a story that could have generated both for the fans and for the people who've never seen or read the Smurfs. So the Sony movie didn't do a single thing about that, diving into the Smurf lore. The Paramount movie looked like it was going to do that with a trilogy. I mean, it could have gone either way. It could have been, amazing, or it could have been terrible. But I think, in my opinion, it would have been hands down much better than the Sony movie that we got.
It could have actually brought the Smurfs into a modern-day world without feeling tacky or dated.
Yeah, well, the good news is that there were a couple of animated segments that came out that, were also, tagged in, that came with the Smurfs DVDs and Blu-rays, that many people say that's the Smurfs movie that they should have gotten. Classic 2D, and it focuses on the Smurfs. It doesn't focus on any of the live-action characters. But there's good news is that they're actually doing another reboot of the Smurfs movie, in which it's going to follow really close to the cartoons and on the comics. So finally, almost 10 years later, we are finally getting the Smurfs movie we deserve to get.
That's a relief, and we can forget about those horrible hybrids that were in the early 2010s. And to be honest, with this being in 2008, this would have probably been a godsend to cinema, considering that most animated movies in the mid to late 2000s had taken a downhill spiral.
Yeah, not a very memorable year for Nickelodeon movies, or even Nickelodeon in general, so maybe the Smurfs movie would have actually picked up a little bit for them.
Yeah, it probably would have, and it probably would have actually turned Nickelodeon into a different direction.
Yeah, definitely. Alright, well, that is it for this episode. Tune in next time as we're going to be discussing about another set of sequels that Nickelodeon wanted to release that was based off one of the worst movies of all time. We'll see you next time.
We will see you soon.
So